So I'm Steve Walsh, and this is the first of a series of events sponsored by the institute that I run, the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, generously supported, I should say, by the CH Foundation. It's a week-long series of related events about Shakespeare. So we're trying to kind of bring a common focus to the various sort of intellectual interests and perspectives represented here in our extremely talented faculty. And now let me turn the stage over to, as I say, it's a duet. This is kind of the first. But Dr. Jocoy and I have been working together a long time on the Institute's opera programming. I don't know if any of you have taken advantage of that. But she is not only the most erudite person who I've met thus far on the faculty, and I've met a lot, but also the most entertaining. So you have the floor.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, of course, to the CH Foundation for supporting this week generously. And so, the title to this talk today, as you see, is "To be made a ballad of." And this is a lesser-known quote from Shakespeare about the idea that, in his period, to be made a ballad of was actually a very negative thing. Because, just like scandals today, if your name gets put into something that's witty and memorable, especially in an age when most people were not really reading, but really memorizing things, then your reputation was just gone. So, this idea of being made a ballad of, Shakespeare says, is one of the worst things that can happen to a man. Another famous quote by Shakespeare, and he puts this actually in the voice of his character from A Winter's Tale, Autolycus, the ballad seller, who says, quote, in a very funny way, "I love a ballad, but even too well, if it be doleful matter, merrily set down, or a very pleasant thing indeed, and sung lamentably," end quote. So this is really the heart of what we're getting at today. Because yes, we'll talk a little bit about ballads as scandal and ballads as things that were used as news before newspapers existed. But this thing here, this very, very insightful quote that he puts in the mouth of Autolycus, the ballad seller, is really the crux of the entire talk today. Because when he says, "a doleful matter merrily set, or a pleasant thing sung lamentably," he's talking about the disjuncture that happens between a tune and a text. And we can understand that, certainly. We think of things in minor as being sad and things that are in major as being happy. And that's the kind of thing that we often associate today with music being sad or music being happy. But in Shakespeare's time, it was much more complex. In fact, most of the tunes that were well known amongst the populace, including people who did not read, were tunes that had very specific themes, not just happy and sad, but things very, very ornate almost. Tales not just about betrayal and love lost, but things about a happy story of a maid finding her lover after having been separated for 7 to 20 years or something like that. And so these very almost, well, dare I say, Baroque themes that were not simply happy, sad, angry, pleased, but very detailed. And so when a person, arguably, when a person around 1600 heard one of these tunes, they would know already from the start what they were hearing. So let me just play a few of these so we get a few in our ear. This first one, if I can get it to go, is Robin Goodfellow. So this is one of the Robin Hood ballads. We'll just hear a little bit of it. From all along standing the king of ghosts and goblins, that mad Robin I, and his commandment sent to you the king's God's gift. Whatever wrong is here among, in any corner where I go, I will see and merry be, and make good sport with ho ho ho. Okay. This one down below here is "And Let the Cannikin Clink," and this is...
And let me the cannikin clink, clink, and let me the cannikin clink. A soldier's a man, and life's but a span, why then let a soldier drink.
And that one's from Othello. This one here, I'm only going to play one verse off, but you'll get the sound of it in your ear. This is the Carman's Whistle. You actually get to see them performing this one. Notice we hear lots of repeats in this music. It's supposed to help you remember it easier.
As our bride was walking by the breaking of the day into a pleasant meadow, a young man took his way, and looking around about him to mark what he could see, at length he spied a fair maiden under a meadow tree.
Okay, so it has been estimated that we have now remaining about half of the tunes that Shakespeare and his audiences might have heard around the year 1600. The songs and dances that filled the stage, bringing joy and in some cases dire melancholy, are to a degree lost to us. Others, although we may have them yet, are lost on us. That is to say, or rather ask, why care about the music on Shakespeare's stage? We surely have good pieces to play that can fill the role. Why worry about songs and dances long dead when we can play something modern and perhaps meaningful to us? And so I want to play just really quickly this next slide because we have an example of such a thing. Very famous piece, Hold Thy Peace, from Twelfth Night. And so here's an example of what we believe it sounded like. If I can play it for us.
Hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace.
Hold thy
peace,
thou
thou
hold
thy peace, thou hold thy peace, thou this, thou nay, hold thy peace, thou nay, thou nay, hold thy peace, thou nay.
All right, and this is what was recently done with it through the Stratford stage.
Hold thy peace, thou knave, thou knave. Hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace, thou knave, thou knave. Hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace, thou knave, thou knave. Hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace, thou knave, thou knave. Hold thy peace, I hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, and I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, and I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, and I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, and I pray thee, hold thy peace. Hold thy peace, and I pray thee, hold thy peace.
So, this is at the Shakespeare Birthplace Theatre in Stratford. It might give us pause. It sort of sounds like a 60s greaser thing. But again, if you know the context where this fits, in the middle of this play, these guys are sitting around and basically they don't care about the people who are sleeping in the next room and the room after that and the room after that. And so this is sort of part of their drunken plot at revenge and getting back at them in petty little ways. And so, in a way, going sort of full-on bang on a can, as they have here, is actually fairly appropriate for this use of music in Shakespeare, even though it has very little, if anything, to do with the original version. So, and I need this to turn. So, let's talk about ballads. What are ballads? What do we think ballads are? What do they mean to us? And so, on a normal class day, I would put all these guys on the spot and have them tell me what ballads are. But we did talk about this before, so I'll just summarize. Ballads today, when we talk about them musically, are pieces that are usually strophic, which means the verses repeat. We hear the same music with different text. The repetition is important because it allows the singer to focus not on the music so much, but rather on remembering the words. Because ballads, for our definition of them, and also for Shakespeare's definition of them, the most important aspect is that they are stories that are told through music. Songs that tell stories. That is their most important purpose in the early modern period, and even arguably still today. So broadside ballads, however, are a slightly different animal. And I want to focus on them because these are the ones that Shakespeare was mostly interacting with. They were popular musical pieces of the 17th century. Unlike traditional or folk ballads, these, I love this quote, veritable dunghills, as the ballad scholar Dr. Francis Child called them, were urban creations with texts about topical, even recognizable subjects. The better recognizable, the better. Much like modern tabloids, ballads carried scandalous or sensational news, which was intended to attract audiences and promote gossip. Although some manuscript versions existed, and here's one here that you don't see them very often. There we go. It's a manuscript version of a ballad. These ballads were usually disseminated through print. So cheaply printed on one side, on a broadside sheet. They sold usually for a penny and were accessible to mass audiences. So this one, of course, is the generation after Shakespeare's time during the period of the Civil War. But here's one, well, this one's early in the Civil War because we're talking about Roundheads. But you see the important aspects of a broadside. We have lots of text. We have some images, usually woodcuts, a title, and then the most important thing here is that where's the music? There's no music. Let's get to that. While broadside texts were transmitted through print, tunes were not provided on the printed ballad sheet until about the end of the 17th century. Most ballad texts would, however, indicate a tune with the rubric, and you can see it up there, to be sung to the tune of, which is right over this gentleman's pointy hat. Referencing a popular tune that everyone was supposed to know. These tunes were sometimes shared with traditional ballads, while others were newer creations popularized by the theater or by ballad singers themselves. Though ballad texts have commonly been studied independent of the tunes, this was not how early modern audiences experienced them. As the stationer from the 1600s, Henry Brougham, explained in a preface to his collection of ballads called The Rump, you saw that title a moment ago, quote, "If you read these ballads and not sing them, the poor ballads are undone," end of quote. Clearly, there was something in the tunes themselves that was integral to the understanding of these works. Ballad tunes were still transmitted orally. Audiences learned them casually from ballad mongers or anyone who knew the relevant tunes. In this transmission practice, tunes were usually learned with texts, not independently. Due to this, tunes became mentally tied to certain important texts or themes in listeners' or performers' minds. Just as advertising jingles remind modern audiences of products, popular ballad tunes came to signify thematic material and could convey their message, as I said before, regardless of words. These associations were even more powerfully embedded for non-literate audiences whose reliance on memory was much more keen than our own. These associations were further reinforced by the iconographic images that accompanied them, these woodcuts, as mentioned up here. And let me show you another one that's really very well known. These are would cut to the very famous tune, Fortune My Foe. And then the text down below, the respective ones. We're going to perform this one for you. And this is my accompanist, Christopher Hepburn, who will be, although most of the time these probably wouldn't have been accompanied, except maybe by lute, perhaps by guitar, but we'll just run with the piano today. Fortune, my foe, why dost thou frown on me? And will thy favors never better me? Wilt thou, I say, forever breed my pain? And wilt thou not restore my joys again? So, this song was so well known that over 200 ballads have been set to it. It is always about death, and it is always about the death of a commoner who deserved it. Okay? So whenever we hear the title, Fortune My Foe, or even when we just hear this tune, you all are too young to remember, but some of you might remember anyway, that there was a popular show called Name That Tune, and people could name the tune sometimes within just 2 or 3 notes. Well, that's the kind of oral recognition that we're talking about with these types of tunes for people who lived in Shakespeare's England. So, successive texts that were layered upon these ballad tunes, which in musical terms we might call contrafacta, made use of the tune's associations, often reinforcing the prevalent message with new but similar texts, which acted as successful and, ballad writers hoped, profitable formula. Even when there seemed to be great diversity of text, as was common for the most popular tunes like this one, there was still a connecting thematic thread. But with the reuse of tunes, there developed inevitable mental layering, an interplay of old and new texts, wherein the tunes functioning as texts in their own right could either support or subvert the new lyrics that were appended to them. Although this practice of layering and parodying earlier texts was venerable by the mid-17th century, and certainly by Shakespeare's time as well, the subversive qualities of this practice reached a fevered pitch during the English Civil War and interregnum period. My study of 20 of the most popular ballad tunes and their extant texts, starting about 1580 and going up to about the 1660s, shows this progress of layered associations, which created a witty interdependence of texts and tune that can be seen in 2 popular melodies, Greensleeves and Well-a-Day. So we all know Greensleeves, or at least we think we do. The tune Greensleeves appears to have become popular in the last quarter of the 16th century, around 1588, which should also raise a red flag to my students in my class because that's also the date of the Spanish Armada. Although many have tried to relate the tune back to the court of King Henry VIII, the earlier sources are from the 1580s. Texts from many of these earlier prints are no longer extant, but their titles or incipits remain on record at the Stationer's Register, and at least imply that there was a central female character who wore green sleeves. The first entries of the tune, and you can see this on your handout, numbers 1 through 4, were made within days, and in some cases hours of each other. So it appears to have been an instant success. The first few surviving texts do not mention the lady, but instead discuss treachery and disloyalty. Numbers 5, the Lord of Lorne, the false steward, and treason against the King of the Scots. Number 12, you traitors. Number 11, oh, what a wicked world. All discuss betrayal, whether it be against a lord, the monarch, or God. And here, sorry, this is the Lord of Lorne, right there. So again, you see lots of text, and it says tune is Greensleeves at the top there. And so it's all about a steward that tries to have his master, his young master, killed. So again, treachery is really at the heart of Greensleeves. Sounds like a good Christmas tune to me. All right, so all of them discuss betrayal. This would seem to be one of the earliest themes attached to the tune. Of the earlier text, only number 10, a new courtly sonnet of Lady Greensleeves, seems to bring in the lady at all. And this is the text found in A Handful of Pleasant Delights, the most famous one. Here, she features as the object of the lover's complaint, quote, Alas, my love, you do me wrong, to treat me thus discourteously. Okay, to cast me off. For I have loved you well and long, delighting in your company. And so this is really the most famous early text. And it's a courtly love lyric. Her rejection of the lover is the central thing. It's not the lady, it's the rejection. The famous text of this courtly love interpretation of a false or dishonorable behavior by the lady. The lady's actions did not amount to treason, but in terms of courtly love, her behavior is just as heinous. So, Shakespeare seems to confirm the idea that early modern audiences thought of Greensleeves as a tune fit for dark or unhappy subjects by using it in his Merry Wives of Windsor. In Act 2, Scene 1, Mistress Ford claims that Falstaff's disposition and his words, quote, do no more adhere and keep place together than the 100th Psalm to the tune of Greensleeves, end quote. Contrasting the main idea of the 100th Psalm, which is that of joyful praise or make a joyful noise, with the tune of Greensleeves, in this way strongly suggests that Shakespeare's audience would not have associated such positive themes with this tune. Later in the play, in 5:5, Falstaff is ruffled again by the same Mistress Ford and exclaims, quote, let the sky rain potatoes, let it thunder to the tune of Greensleeves, hail kissing comfits and snow eringos. And so, let there come a tempest of provocation, I will hide me here. So, again, Greensleeves in both of these allusions is meant to be something that is negative, or in the case of Falstaff, perhaps something provocative, like, oh, perhaps a lady of the night. That might be tempting him, and he's saying he's going to hide from that temptation. So, additionally, dropping the title of the piece as Shakespeare does into the dialogue implies familiarity with the sound of the tune itself. Although still part of the oral tradition and therefore open to musical interpretation, most people had an idea of what the tune sounded like. So just a lute version. That's our A part. Just repeating should be our B part. Okay, so now he's going to go on and do quite a few variations which we don't need to hear. So, though some of the texts from the 1580s were reprinted in the following decades, the next significant text set to Greensleeves is actually a piece or a title given to it called the Blacksmith's Tune. This jocular text about the trade of the blacksmith, and this happens right around Shakespeare's lifetime, was the production of a literary quasi-military fraternity of men that called themselves the Order of the Fancy. Not strictly part of the tribe or sons of Ben, or the poet Ben Jonson, this group included figures such as Sir John Suckling, Sir John Menes, James Smith, and the playwright Philip Massinger. Timothy Rayler, a literary historian who has studied the order extensively, believes that the Blacksmith Ballad is one of the main communal artistic projects of the group, and it also constitutes a verbal play on Smith's name, one of the main poets involved. This irreverent text acknowledges the idea of rejection, telling the story of Venus's rejection of Vulcan, the blacksmith of the gods. But then it becomes a witty cavalier mockery of rejection, summoned up by its new refrain phrase, quote, which nobody can deny. All right? This becomes the refrain of Greensleeves, which nobody can deny. Today we think of it as the refrain for He's the Jolly Good Fellow, but only in the United States. If you go to England, they have a different refrain. And so say all of us, and so sing of us. They don't sing which nobody can deny anymore because it's too late and, oh, anyway, it's very cool. Anyway, though it is clearly tongue-in-cheek, the text also rejects society's rejection of the humble trade of blacksmithing, playing with the tune's earlier associations of betrayal and denial. Of all the trades that e'er I see, there's none with the blacksmith compared may be. With so many several tools works he, which nobody can deny. During the age after Shakespeare, when we get into the Civil War in the 1640s, the order was split up by the Civil War. Most were in exile. But the refrain, which nobody can deny, continued to circulate orally, first as the motto of their old fraternity, but later with a renewed meaning of treachery, reminding the listener that something which should not be denied, the king's right, was in contest, along with many other traditional English ideas and customs. Traditional Englishness, basically, was on the line. Though they were often printed without woodcuts, when images were appended to green sleeves, which nobody can deny, they usually featured cavaliers, such as those seen in figure 1 of your handout. So down there on the bottom. And so it kind of emphasizes this whole idea that green sleeves is a cavalier tune. Later on, it becomes a Jacobite tune too. So many parodies of this exist. One of the main ones is just the next one I'll show you, which actually, so here's the blacksmith's tune, as we just read. And then also we get a tune called The Brewer. And I'll just look at the first 2 verses there. Of course, they recognize the blacksmith's trade, which nobody can deny, and now many new lords from him there did spring of all the trades, he still was their king, for the brewer had the world in a sling, which nobody can deny. And the brewer is actually Cromwell. So they're making fun of him throughout, using this song as a cavalier tune to thwart or at least mock Cromwell. So for the rest of the century, the political guise of Greensleeves was the most popular, either as the blacksmith or as called, which nobody can deny. We almost never even see it referenced as Greensleeves at this point. Maintaining its older associations with treachery and falseness, but now as something to be countered with loyalty. Even as a Christmas song, which it did appear as once, number 14 on your list, it introduces the idea of sin combined with a message of how we must fight against it. Quote, "The old year now away is fled, the new year now is entered. Then let us now our sins down tread, and joyfully all appear. Let's merry be this holiday, and let us now both sport and play. Hang sorrow, let's care cast away. God send you a happy new year." And that whole idea about hanging sorrow, that's a cavalier catchphrase. So even the Christmas Carol has become political. As familiar as the tune Greensleeves is today, the tune for Well-a-Day is generally unfamiliar, owing to its confused transmission history. Well-a-Day, very popular in the time. We think that it also comes from the term well-away, which was used by Chaucer, and the phrase is, "Alas, alack, and well-a-day," obviously meaning sadness. Although several versions appeared from 1850 forward in studies and anthologies, the tune from the end of the manuscript has become the most common, and we'll go ahead and perform that.
Sorry, there seems to be a bad string.
Entries in the Stationer's Register go all the way back to the 1550s, and the word itself, as I said, is related back to Chaucer's time for desolation. But the first text to become associated with the tune in Shakespeare's time was written to the lament of the execution of Lord Essex in 1601, with the text beginning "Sweet England's pride's gone way," number 1 on your list. The tune became associated with the death speeches of upper-class aristocracy, which were also called good nights. This can also be seen in the woodcut images of aristocratic death at the block, rather than the lower class hangings that we saw for Fortune My Foe. So see figure 3 on your handout. There should be some images of aristocrats about to meet their end. Unlike other songs commonly associated with execution, such as Fortune My Foe, Welladay became associated with the idea of undeserved death or intense grief and remorse. Lamentation is the common theme in these works, as in the titles of number 1 through 3, the aristocratic figures number prominently, as in number 9, Sir Thomas Wentworth, number 12 about King Henry VIII's queens, number 11 for Charles I. Such associations with lamentation may have occasioned another writer, again right around Shakespeare's time, to think about this tune when he offered it as a melody for Psalm 130, quote, "Out of the depths in great distress, where doubts and dangers me oppress," end quote. That's number 7 on your list. Shakespeare uses Welladay to denote deep sadness, but notice that it is only used to note the death of someone considered to be important, or that Shakespeare wanted his audiences to see as noble. And so he uses Welladay in both Pericles and, most notably, in Romeo and Juliet, to really heighten this sense of loss and lamentation at the death. Greensleeves in Welladay serve to illustrate the types of thematic associations that became embedded in tunes. These tunes signified certain ideas that were transmitted when the tunes were learned in an oral tradition and were generally reinforced by subsequent texts. Throughout this reuse, the original tunes associated might be added to or altered slightly without essentially changing their meanings. After the 1650s, though, when many of the tunes were printed, it was easier to learn them independently from the texts. These tune identities that we've been talking about began to fracture. However, many strong tune associations from the early 17th century and the interregnum continued to resonate through the Restoration, which nobody can deny became linked to the Tory party almost as strongly as another tune called When the King Enjoys His Own Again by Martin Parker. A piece linked so loyally with the House of Stuart that it followed James II into exile. Shadows of these Civil War tune associations can be seen as late as the Beggar's Opera in 1728, when Macbeth sings his Goodnight medley of royalist tunes in the last act, ending notably with Greensleeves. These hidden layers of meaning within the ballad tunes uncover contemporary slang, scandals, and cultural propaganda that would otherwise remain closed off to us. Now, just a few other examples. We have Macbeth encountering the weird sisters, and we have, of course, the famous scene about the bubbling cauldron, but later on, when he meets the witches again, he encounters them and has a slightly longer encounter. So the tune that is mentioned in Shakespeare, and it just says black spirits and white, right? Actually, it just says black spirits and it's in italics, so we know it's a song, but he doesn't actually give it to us. So this is a recreation of this tune, and I'll just play a little bit of it for us.
Black spirits and white, red spirits and grey, mingle, you get mingle may. Titty, tiffin, keep it stiffin, fire drink, pumpkin, make it lucky. Lion rapping, you must go in, sucking and teaching from blossom and spring. Round, around, about, oh, we'll come running, oh, good keep out. Round, about, oh, we'll come running, oh, good keep out.
Okay, we'll stop there. All right, so they're going round and round, as we see in the depiction here from the 1640s. We have several earlier ones as well. And what's particularly demonic about this is that they were going counterclockwise. So, if you dance in a circle, and you're not facing in, you're facing out, even stranger, and you're going clockwise, it's a bad thing. Don't do that. Okay. This is set to a piece called Packington's Pound, which is actually also known popularly as the Song of Damnation. So it fits. Fits quite well with the weird sisters or the witches of Macbeth. Another example also, let's see. Another play, of course, that uses quite a bit of music is King Lear. And of course, in the efforts, well, both real madness as experienced by Lear and then fake madness put on by Edgar. Both characters are sort of trying to create these ideas of madness through music. And so the tune that's used most notably throughout this play is a piece called Tom o' Bedlam. And so here's our words down here: from the hag and hungry goblin that into rags would rend ye, and the spirit that stands by the naked man in the book of moons defend ye. All right, so we've got lots of classical terminology like Don Quixote. The person has probably been reading too many books or fantasies or romances, and they've gone over the edge, and they think themselves more important and interesting than they are. And you might ask yourself, how did they know anything about madness? We don't have psychology in this period. But actually, the title is our indication, because it tells us about a man who is of Bedlam. Bedlam, of course, being the very important or madness hospital, Bethlehem Hospital, that was in the center of London and had been there since the Middle Ages. Originally, it was very tiny. It could only hold about 32 people, and when they were full up and they needed space, they would let them go. You're fine, you're cured, and they would give them a special medallion to wear that said that they were considered to be crazy, but not that bad. And they could go out on the streets and sing and dance antically for money. Yes, that's where busking started. Anyway, but if you were considered to be dangerous, then they'd keep you in. Now, at the beginning of Shakespeare's period, there was discussion of a new hospital. Bedlam was too full. That's why we've now used the word as a term for crazy, riotous behavior. You know, if your party's a bedlam, then you better watch out, because the police are probably heading your way. So in this period, they actually, shortly after Shakespeare's time, they expanded Bethlehem Hospital, made it huge. It could hold about 200 people, and it became like a zoo. People visiting London would pay a penny to go in and look at the mad people, just like they would go in and pay a penny to look at the lions and several other animals that they kept in the tower, like a small zoo. So we have this, believe it or not, on people's travel records of the period, that they intend to go and visit the crazy people. They want to go see them and throw things at them. Yeah. So we know that plenty of people in this period actually did witness real madness and saw these behaviors. And we can imagine that Shakespeare would have probably, being a student of human nature, would probably have gone and even seen this as well. And probably seen the ones that were let out as being not too crazy. And so there's quite a few images of madness just out on the normal street, as well as not really too far away in this period. And quite a few stereotypes about it as well. So let's play part of this tune. Again, it's meant to sound kind of creepy, scary.
Tom is come to view the world again, to see if he can cure his despair and bring fears and cares of Christ his soul. Hark on the endless furious howl. Pluto laughs and Proserpine is glad to see poor angry Tom of Bedlam mad.
That was a different one, sorry, but very similar in text. We still have the same kind of classical imagery and a lot of the same sorts of gestures throughout. Again, this idea of somehow being lost in a world of make-believe is the most common that we see in these. So, one last piece by Shakespeare to finish this off, but it's the granddaddy. So, of course, the most known and arguably the most important of Shakespeare's plays, Hamlet, also has some of the most potent uses of ballads and ballad allusions. Hamlet himself does not sing, although he mentions and alludes to several ballads throughout his antic disposition. But it is to Ophelia that we turn for the true genius of the ballad maker's art. Hamlet himself may have been clever in his use of the play within a play to catch the conscience of the king, but To Ophelia, Shakespeare gives a second embedded drama, layered and coded throughout, to reference popular songs of her day, and bawdy ones at that, which drama and literary historians have been at pains to explain for many years. But the true historical reference here, and the excitement for me, is not in the songs individually, but rather in them as a complex. They index a popular street play, a ballad jig, the period that would have been known to many in the audience, a street entertainment. The same way that modern audiences might be able to reference or even act out a famous scene from a movie like, oh, I don't know, the climactic scene from Star Wars, Luke, I am your father, right? Okay. Everybody knows certain scenes from certain movies. And so that's the same type of reference that people would have for many of these ballad jigs that were performed out in the street. So the cause of Ophelia's madness and apparent suicide in Shakespeare's Hamlet has attracted discussion and criticism since the premiere of the play. Contemporary audiences, informed by Timothy Bright's Treatise of Melancholy from 1586, labeled her affliction as lovesickness, a common female malady of the day, which Bright described as a fragile and likely delusional state, usually the consequence of romantic rejection. The symptoms of this condition included the irrational belief in their intended's love and fidelity, resort to melancholy or histrionic outbursts, and the hyper-amplification of the sexual drive, evidenced through actions and verbal musical outbursts. This has been understood to have motivated the body quality of Ophelia's lyrics, indicating a helplessness and a confusion in her mind between her roles as virgin, potential bride, and whore. Although Ophelia's musical rantings have been historically understood as love-sick musings of an overheated female brain, Elizabethan conceptions of madness also sometimes imputed to madness the capacity for unusual insight or truth-speaking. This touched aspect is identifiable in Ophelia's songs, which may be read as the story of her plight, told through a combination of lyrics and ballad associations embedded in the tunes themselves. Identifying likely tunes on the basis of both manuscript and early print evidence, and Ross Steffen's groundbreaking work with the reconstruction of Shakespearean tunes in his book, Shakespeare's Songbook, highly recommended. This presentation argues that Ophelia may have been or believed herself to be pregnant. This reading is further supported by the connections between the four songs in Ophelia's Mad Scene and the popular Elizabethan jig drama Francis's New Jig, which is the ballad drama I referred to. This hypothesis provides the possibility of reading a hidden narrative within Ophelia's songs. An example is in her initial Mad Song choice, Walsingham, from 4/5, which held contemporary associations with childbirth. From this initial proclamation, and here, are some of the iconic images, both old and new, of Ophelia. And here are her songs during her Mad Scene. So, she has no music before her breakdown, but after she has two scenes in which she sings a total of 4 pieces: Walsingham, A Soldier's Life, Robin is to Greenwood Gone, and Go From My Window. The song Walsingham has associations with courtship and seduction, and her final outburst of "And will he not come again" to the tune of Go From My Window, which embodies the concepts of rejection and death. Such a reading, which combines evidence from text, play script, contextual references, and the narrative association of borrowed tunings, opens up new vistas for the understanding of Ophelia's sad journey. Ophelia's first tune when she enters, and here we go. Sorry, let me find my cursor, which has disappeared. Where'd you go, cursor? There you are. Oops, we don't want to do that just yet. Well, I guess we could, but I just wanted to show you this Walsingham. Where did my cursor go? Sorry, my cursor's just being nasty. Okay, there it is. Thank you. Walsingham. That's what I wanted to show you. Okay, so so she goes, or the character in this ballad goes to Walsingham, because Walsingham is actually, at this time, a pilgrimage site for women. They go there to reference children, childhood, the birth of children, And it was commonly known in Tudor times that to take a trip to Walsingham, or England's Nazareth, was made by women in many cases as a prayer to the Virgin for conception or safe childbirth. So this is her first song. I don't think Shakespeare chose this willy-nilly. And so we'll just sing the first two verses of this. As you came from Walsingham, from that holy land, wed not with my true love, by the way as you came. Oops. How should I, your true love, know that I've met many a one, as I came from the holy land, and I've So it's not a happy tune, clearly, but it's usually, again, as a kind of last resort. Women who had tried repeatedly to get pregnant but were unable to. Noble women who feared for their marriage if they weren't able to get wed with child. And this is actually also associated with Catherine of Aragon, who told Henry VIII in a letter that she was making a trip to Walsingham. So it was a coded point of saying that she believed herself pregnant at the time. So. Now, there's quite a bit of discussion within Ophelia about her Catholic leanings, because again, we have this sort of 50-year effect with Shakespeare because of the Reformation in England and how long it takes to really take effect. And so this idea of someone still visiting an abbey or a convent, or even as Hamlet tells her in a later scene, to get thee to a nunnery, is still a possible thing in the imagination, if not in the possible land of England at that time. It's still part of people's speech patterns. It's still part of the way people think. And taking pilgrimages, all of these things are still part of the way that people conceptualize religion, even though the Reformation has happened. By placing Walsingham tune first in Ophelia's dramatic repertoire, Shakespeare appears to be allowing her to make a statement about female power and the possible loss thereof. Additionally, given the strong associations of the Walsingham shrine with childbirth, it appears likely that Ophelia is making a comment about her possible status of being with child. Her second song is, and here's our part of our tune there. So her second tune is Tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day, which is supposedly set also to the Jews' dance. So. Ophelia's next song after the discussion of the medieval female figure of the baker's daughter, and she says this in her text, if you flip to the last page, she says very memorably, they say the owl was a baker's daughter, which is actually an apocrypha if you read about the early life of Jesus Christ. So she's referencing one of these childhood stories about Jesus, who supposedly turned the baker's daughter into an owl because he was mad at her for not giving him bread. So the next piece is Tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day. There is no known tune that survives from Elizabethan sources for this text. However, the traditional theater tune from the 18th century is an older tune contemporary with Shakespeare's time called The Soldier's Life or The Soldier's Dance. The text is clearly significant and evocative. Ophelia recounts the story of a maid who unabashedly offers herself to a man. And I am made at your window to be your Valentine. The man certainly obliges her wishes and lets in the maid. That, quote, out a maid never departed more. By the 16th century, the celebration of the Catholic Saints' Day for St. Valentine's Day had already become associated with the idea of love and romance. Although this can be seen as a symptom of the ever-widening rift of the early modern period between the idea of holy day and holiday, it is still possible to imagine that an early modern maid may have somehow gotten the wrong idea about what her role was supposed to be in relation to men. Given the erroneous idea that St. Valentine was somehow encouraging female sexuality as a part of being a good, even pious Protestant, this makes even more sense in light of the fact that Protestant reformers had removed the possibility of being a chaste female martyr. Those figures had disappeared with the old religion, Catholic religion, and extreme female piety as expressed through chastity or nunneries was almost mocked in this period as a denial of God's purpose for women. The tune The Soldier's Life, with the full title, Who List to Lead a Soldier's Life, is found in multiple Elizabethan sources and in John Playford's famous Dancing Master of 1650. Although some of the texts associated with the tune seem to reference the idea of war through their titles, it is usually about the country delights of a maid that was deep in love. So, this is the association of this tune. It's about basically the soldier finding a country maid, having a good afternoon, leaving. Okay? So, our first one's about childbirth, our second one is about a soldier having a good afternoon. Let's get on to the third one. The third piece that she sings, Robin is to Greenwood Gone. So, Robin is to Greenwood Gone, as she sings, they bore him barefaced on the bier, hey nonny nonny hey, and in his grave rained many a tear, fare you well my dove. You must sing down a down and call him down a down. So the original text though is Robin is to Greenwood Gone, leaving me here to sigh all alone, I am resolved to have no other boy, for bonny sweet Robin is all my joy. So again, she's in love, this character, in the original, and this tune is therefore associated with, again, ideas of the female in love and ultimately left or abandoned by her lover, who leaves her to go off to the Greenwood, wherever that is. All right, so that's the third tune that Ophelia sings as part of this entertainment or her mad scene. Her last one is Go From My Window. Ophelia's final song, And Will He Not Come Again? Although Shakespeare does not specify a tune, based on the theatrical history and the verse structure, the contemporary tune Go From My Window is indicated. Coincidentally, this is the same tune for the final part of Atwell's jig that I mentioned, the ballad jig. In Ophelia's text, she is clearly focused on death, seemingly on the death of her father. Her reference to the flaxen pole has often elicited comments about her body delusional state. Polite girls do not speak of such things. Mad women, though, clearly have a certain amount of sexual license. The text associated with the tune And Go From My Window tells the story of a rejected lover who, through exposure to the elements and exposure ultimately, without safe harbor, to the devil, moves toward the idea of death, just as Ophelia herself. So, he comes to the lover's window and she says, go from my window, love, go. Go from my window to the rain, wind and the rain will drive you back again. You cannot be lodged here. And so, like the scene in Romeo and Juliet, he's at her window, and she says, nope, go. And sends him off out into the world. Go From My Window mirrors Ophelia's referencing of the women standing at the window in the earlier St. Valentine's tune, seemingly creating some narrative continuity. The protagonist in one instance stands at the window and is admitted. Later, the protagonist stands at the window, but after the earlier indiscretion is now told adamantly, you cannot be lodged here. The song occurs after the famous flowers scene of 4-5, where Ophelia re-enters the stage under the apparent illusion that sticks are herbs and flowers, from whence she proceeds to give them with meaningful comments to the members of the court. Read in terms of the narrative I have suggested by the present presentation, the flower scene takes on an even darker significance. The comments about rosemary, which was the traditional herb of presence at weddings, is paired with pansies, a flower for remembrance. So pray you, love, remember. Fennel and columbines were popularly known among period herbalists to assist in childbirth, both speeding and easing labor. Rue, perhaps the most important inclusion, is the only herb that Ophelia singles out for herself. It was commonly used in Elizabethan times as an abortificant, or for abortions, as a tea infusion. Finally, daisies and violets, which are now wilted, respectively, denote the happiness and safety she has lost with the death of her father. Following this, and Will He Not Come Again, seems to reference not only her father's death and Hamlet's rejection, but also her ultimate rejection of life, her own and possibly that of her unborn child. This tune is also referenced in Francis's New Jig, and let me just show this to you really quickly before I finish up. So this is very unusual. We don't have very many of these from Shakespeare's time, but this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 ballads on one big sheet. And by doing that, Adwell, who set this thing here, Francis's New Jig, between a gentleman and a Richard, a farmer, to the tune of Walsingham, that's the first one, and then it says down here, the Bugle Boy, which we believe is the soldier's tune. We have Adwell's New Jig to the tune of, and I went to Walsingham up there. Anyway, so four ballads all on one page, and the story is actually very interesting because it tells the story of a noble who wants to bed a woman of a lower status. And instead of actually sleeping with him, she creates a trick so that he actually ends up sleeping with his wife. But the whole story, taken as a whole, is about sexual promiscuity, male power over female lack of power, especially because of the class system, and then this treachery, whether it's him wanting to bed her or her not allowing it by, getting the wife in on it. But still, so it's not the same story as Ophelia and Hamlet, definitely, but there's a strong overriding thread of sexuality and treachery that runs through this whole story. And it's a little bit funny, but Ophelia's isn't quite so funny. So we circle back to the original question. Is it important that we know these tunes and what they meant? And herein lies the issue. Shakespeare, like many of his contemporaries, especially balladeers, knew that tunes themselves were important, semiotically laced with meaning. It didn't matter if the piece was being sung, hummed, or played instrumentally, the tune still had an associative impact that could be used to set the scene, make comparisons or allusions, or to help build a character. So, is it important to use these tunes in modern versions of Shakespeare? No. But it is important to know about them, and what those layers of meaning implied for Elizabethan audiences. This, I would suggest, is imperative. As imperative as any other historical or contextual work that we might do to better understand the theater of this period. Shakespeare's songs give us a peek, pulling away the curtain in a sense, to reveal notes, clues, scandals, and other important thoughts that inform his words. And we would be wise to heed them. Thank you.